So good day everyone. Today I will discuss the codes. So a fundamental subdivision of a language into spoken and written forms, at least insofar as it relates to whether the text is detached from its maker at the point of reception, is often regarded as representing a broad division into different codes rather than merely subcodes. So in a codes, there are a social code. So this is the verbal language. So verbal language, it belongs to the phonological. Phonological, where we can produce a sounds or how we pronounce a particular words or a um, phrases, a syntactical, a lexical, a prosodic, and paralinguistic subcodes. So that belong to the verbal language. So in the bodily codes, we have the bodily contact, the proximity, the physical orientation, appearance, facial expression. These are the bodily codes, the gaze, the head nods, the gestures, and the postures. So the community codes, the fashions, the clothings, and the cars. So the behavioral codes belongs the protocols, the rituals, the rules, the playing, and the games. So the concept of the code is central in illustraturalist semiotics, while Saussure dealt only with the overall code of language. He did of course stress that signs are not meaningful in isolation, but only when they are interpreted in relation to each other. It was another linguistic structuralist, Roman Jacobson, who emphasized that the production and interpretation of text depends upon the existence of codes or conventions for communication. It is influenced by communication theorists. He substituted the distinction of code from message for the Saussurean distinction of langue from parole. So, the code will exist if only if someone will interpret or encode what that particular code meaning, or you cannot just determine that code, you cannot just easily interpret that code because that code is have a steps by steps or have a particular symbols that you can identify that that code is what uh, the code really is. And also it is in the Saussurean's theory or testimony that codes is a arbitrary. It is depends on you how well you identify that codes in your own understanding. And also aside from understanding, it will based on your community, how you surround the people. So codes organize signs into meaningful system which correlate signifiers and signifieds through the structural forms of syntagmism and paradism. If the relationship between a signifier and its signified is relatively arbitrary, then it is clear that interpreting the conventional meaning of signs requires familiarity with appropriate sets of conventions. So if you are familiarized of the set of the convention, then you can identify that particular code. So as Saussure emphasized that signs only acquired meaning and value when they are interpreted in relation to each other. So he believed that the relationship between the signifier and the signified was arbitrary, diba? And then hence interpreting signs or the codes requires a familiarity with the sets of the convention currently in use to communicate the meaning. The conventions of codes represent a social dimension in the semiotics. A code is a set of practices familiar to users of the medium operating within a broad cultural framework. Indeed, as Stuart Hall puts it, there is no intelligible discourse without the operation of code. Society itself depends on the existence of such signifying systems. So that's right. On the society itself, it depends on the existence of particular things or codes. How will you identify that codes or the conventions? Just like the Stuart Hall puts, there is no intelligible discourse without the operation of a code. So, understanding such codes, the relationships and contexts in which they are appropriate is part of what it means to be a member of a particular culture. So, codes are not simply conventions of communication but rather procedural system of related conventions which operate in certain domains. So, um, to furthermore understand the codes, there are types of codes. So, semioticians seek to identify codes and the tacit rules and constraints which underlie the production and interpretation of meaning within each code. So, they have found it convenient to divide codes themselves into groups. So, there are different theories favored in different taxonomies, and while structuralists often follow the principle of parsimony, seeking to find the smallest number of groups deemed necessary or necessity is defined by purposes. No taxonomy is innocently neutral and devoid of ideological assumptions. So, no taxonomy is innocently neutral and devoid of ideological assumption. One might start from a fundamental divide between analog and digital codes from a division according to sensory channels, from a distinction between verbal and non-verbal, and so on. So, to divide the types of codes or the fundamental division, it between the analog, how they will pronounce or give or to communicate a particular text, and another one is a digital codes, the use of the technology or the digital, the use of the modern technology, the how they film, so and so on. You will I will be discuss the digital codes, the analogs. um so, the primary and the most pervasive code in any society is its dominant natural language, within which, as with another codes, there are many subcodes. So, in the textual codes, um, scientific codes including the mathematics, the aesthetic codes within the various expressive arts, the poetry, the drama, the painting, the sculpture, the music, etc., including the classicism, romanticism, and the realism. So in the textual codes, it belongs the poetry, how they will give or pronounced or pulong or shorten the words or the sentences, they in the form of the drama or the painting that will in the code, what how will you interpret a particular drama. It is a romantic or it is a dramatic, it is a sad, a horror, um, painting. How will you interpret the particular code in the painting, if it is a nature or luma na ba siya or new painting, then the sculptures And also, you can code music if it is a happy music, a sad music, because there are some, just like the music of Moira, um, the sad music, but for her, that music is not a sad, because he wrote the music when she is happy. Then it depends. That's why code, it depends on us how we will interpret that particular music. So as the historian said, it is a between the signifier and the signified. So it is also in the genre, the rhetorical and statistic codes, the exposition, the arguments, the description, and the narration, and so on. And it is a mass media codes, including the photographic, the television, the filmic, the radio, the newspapers, and the magazine codes, both technical and conventional, including the format. So, in the interpretive codes, it is the perceptual codes of visual perception by Hall 1973, 132, Nichols 1981, Eco 1982. So note that this code does not assume intentional communication. So ideological codes, more broadly, this includes codes for encoding and decoding text dominant. So interpretive codes, it is the, for example, in the speaker will give a message, then it will encode the receiver, then it will encode the speaker, then it will decoded by the receiver. That, and then more specifically, we may list the ISMS, such as the individualism, the liberalism, the feminism, the racism, the materialism, the capitalism, the progressivism, the conservatism, socialism, objectivism, and the populism. Note, however, that all codes can be seen as ideological. So, these three types of codes correspond broadly to three kinds of knowledge required by interpreters of a text, namely knowledge of. So, these three types of codes required by the interpreters of a text to have a knowledge. So, first, the world or the social knowledge. So, saan ba siya kukuha ng knowledge? So, di ba, it is in the society knowledge. It is how he or she interact in the society, so that he can come up a new vocabulary or something, that a new journal or new words, to get some knowledge. He can communicate or makipaghalubilo in forms of society or in the world. So, the second one is the medium and the genre, or the textual knowledge. Then, the third is the relationship between 1 and 2, or modality judgments. So, those are the three types of codes that correspond broadly to three kinds of knowledge. So, the next is the perceptual codes. So, some theories argue that even our perception of the everyday world around us involves codes. So, Frederick Jameson declares that all perceptual systems are already languages in their own right. So, according to the Gestalt psychologists, there are certain universal features in human visual Perception, which is semiotic terms, can be seen as constituting a perceptual code. We owe the concept of figure and ground in perception to this group of psychologists. So in this, it will concept the figure and the ground. So confronted by a visual image, we seem to need to separate a dominant shape, a figure with a different contour, from what our current concern relegate to background or ground. So, an illustration of this is the famous ambiguous figure which initially seemed to be either a white vase or a black background or two human faces in silhouette facing each other against a white background. So, in addition to introducing the terms figure and ground, the Gestalt psychologists outline what seem to be several fundamental and universal principles, sometimes even called laws of perceptual organization, including, so first, it is the proximity. It is the features which are close together. This is the closeness together. The proximity refers to the closeness of two particular subjects or objects. So similarity, it is features with look similar. So as we can see, there are codes it have a the same silabat. You can also pero naagihapon murag kambal lang na bitaw, pero you can identify unsa jud ang similarities og naapon na sila differences, so that you can identify that that particular object or codes, you can interpret it even though you know that particular codes are similar or have the same faces. Next is the good continuity. Contours based on smooth continuity are preferred to abstract changes of the direction. So the closure interpretation, which produce closed rather than open figures, are favored. The smaller areas tend to be seen as figures against a larger backgrounds. The asymmetrical areas tend to be seen as figures against asymmetrical backgrounds. So the last one, then the surroundness areas, which can be seen as surrounded by others, tend to be perceived as figures. So all of these principles of perceptual organization serve the overarching principles of pregnance, which is the simplest and most stable interpretations are favored. So what the Gestalt principles of perceptual organization suggest is that we may be predisposed towards interpreting ambiguous images in one way rather than another by universal principles. We may accept such a proposition at the same time as accepting that such predisposition may also be generated by other factors. So, in interpreting the images, it really helped this proximity, similarity, the good continuity, the closure, the smallness, the symmetry, the surroundedness, to figure out that particular image in the perceptual. So, next is the social codes. So, it is a constructionist theories argue that linguistic codes play a key role in the construction and maintenance of social realities. We learn not the world but the codes into which it has been structured. So in social codes, you are not just learning about the world because um but it is the code into which it has been structured. Para lang na siya og sign is not a thing, but this one is uh, you cannot learn na we learn not the world but the codes into which it has been structured. What it mean? Um, you are not learning the world but only the code that it is structured that you will interpret, because you cannot interpret without the code, diba? Unsa man imuhang i-interpret kung wala kay ma-code nga makita. So the Whorfian hypothesis or Sauper-Whorf theory is named after the American linguists Edward Sauper and Benjamin Lee Whorf. In its most extreme version, the Sauper-Whorf hypothesis can be described as relating to associated principles. So the linguistic determinism and the linguistic relativism. So, applying these two principles, the Whorfian thesis is that people who speak languages with very different phonological, grammatical, and semantic distinction perceive and think about the world quite differently, their worldviews being shaped or determined by their language. So, the extreme determinist form of the Sauper-Whorf hypothesis is rejected by most contemporary linguists. Within a culture, social differentiation is overdetermined by a multitude of social codes. We communicate our social identities through the work we do, the way we talk, the clothes we wear, our hairstyles, our eating habits, our domestic environments, and positions, our use of leisure time, our modes of traveling, and so on. So in the social identities, this is they belong kung unsa ta the social identities nato, the way how we talk, di ba? Kung unsa ta mo istorya, ato ang mga pananamit, ato ang mga sinuotan, it depends on the, di ba, it depends on the trends, mga trending na itong makita, di ba, ginasuon man dyan nato na. And then also sa ato ang community, kung giunsa sa ato ang community, sa ato ang culture, di ba, it depends gihapon na. And then mga our eating habits, our domestic environment positions, how we use our free time, our weekend time, so and also the moods of travelings and etc. That is the social identities. So the language use act as a key marker of social identity. A controversial distinction regarding British linguistic uses was introduced in the 1960s by the sociolinguist Basil Bernstein between so-called restricted code and elaborated code. So the social differentiation is observed not only from linguistic codes but from a host of nonverbal codes. So a survey of nonverbal codes is not a manageable here, and the interested reader should consult some of the classic texts and specialized guides to the literature. So in the context of the present text, a few examples must suffice to illustrate the importance of nonverbal codes. So in the verbal codes, so it has a non-verbal codes. The non-verbal codes is not a manageable here because as we know that the non-verbal, you will you will consult they expert because it's a nonverbal. It's really hard to identify because it takes time. It takes time to read because you will just reading because you're just reading the text or the paragraph, and then it takes time to create a analytical or the interpretation uh, to interpret because you will analyze first to have a critical thinking, 'di ba? So the nonverbal codes will regulate a sensory regime are of particular interest. Within particular cultural context, there are, for instance, largely in explicit codes of looking which regulate how people may look at other people, including taboos and certain kinds of looking. We learn to read the world in terms of the codes and conventions which are dominant within a specific sociocultural context and the rules within which we socialize. In the process of adapting a way of seeing, we also adapt an identity. The most important constancy in our understanding of reality is our sense of who we are as an individual. So, our sense of self as a constancy is a social construction which is overdetermined by the host of interacting codes within our culture. So, learning these codes involves adapting the values, assumptions, and the worldviews which are built into them without normally being aware of their intervention in the construction of reality. A startling example of this relates to color codes. When I show my own students a picture, so this is an example. When I show my students a picture of two teddy bears, one cloth in powder blue and the other in pale pink, there is seldom any hesitation in suggesting that this signifies respectively male and female. There follows an almost tangible sense of shock when I confront them with this passage. Pink or blue, which is intended for boys and which for girls? This question comes from one of our readers this month, and the discussion may be of interest to others. There has been a great diversity of opinion on this subject, but the generally accepted rule is pink for the boy and blue for the girl. The reason is that pink, being a more decided and stronger color, is more suitable for the boy, while blue, which is more delicate and dainty, is prettier for the girl. So, as we observe, diba, if we know that kung makakita lang tag pink gani o blue, ang pink gani to see to the color pink as we seen is for the girl, and the color blue as we seen is for the boy. But there are some also have an opinion that the pink is for the boy and the blue is for the girl. So as just like he stated here that the color pink is strong girl color that will suitable for boy, while the blue is delicate and dainty is prettier for the girl. So we cannot decide that one because it depends on us how we will interpret ang kanang particular nga color, because kung ato yun ang i-deep kay murag ato na tag sa laing planeta kay murag, it is a debatable talaga what will who kung kanino talaga ang color pink and color blue. So, in the textual codes, every text is a system of signs organized according to code and subcode, which reflect certain values, attitude, beliefs, assumptions, and practices. Codes transcend single texts, linking them together in an interpretive framework which is used by their producers and interpreters. In creating text, we select a combined signs in relation to the codes with which we are familiar. So codes help to simplify phenomena in order to make it easier to communicate experiences. In reading text, we interpret signs with reference to what seem to be appropriate codes. These help to limit their possible meanings. So one of the most fundamental kinds of the textual codes relates to the genre. So traditional definition of genres tends to base on the notion that they are constitute particular convention of the content, such as themes or settings and or forms including structures and style, which are shared by the text, which are regarded as belonging to them. So this mode of defining a genre is deeply problematic. For instance, genre overlap and text often exhibit the convention of more than one genre. It is seldom hard to find texts which are exemption to any given definition of a particular genre. Furthermore, a Zusorian focus on synchronic and analysis ignores the way in which genres are involved in a constant process of change. So despite such theoretical problem, various interpretive communities at particular period in time do operate on the basis of the negotiated is somewhat loose and fluid consensus concerning what they regard as the primary genres relevant to their purposes. So while there is far more than genre codes than that which may seem to relate to specifically textual features, it can still be useful to consider the distinctive properties attributes to a genre by its users. For instance, if we take the case of film, the textual features typically listed by theorists include. So, this is the narrative. So, it is the case of the film, no? Kung kanang mukuha na sila mga film, syempre, mugamit yun na sila og narrative. It is the similar sometimes for the formulaic, the plots, the structures, the predictable, the situation, the sequence, the episode, the obstacles. Narrative, dira na tong mga ang mga plots niya, mga episodes, the mga obstacles, mga conflicts, and the resolution. Flow, narratives, flow, it is the flow of the story na sa movie or drama. The characterization is a similar types of characters, sometimes stereotypes, roles, personal qualities, motivation, goals, behavior. Characterization, diri na itong mga antagonist, protagonist, the mga stereotypes, mga personalities sa mga antagonist, protagonist, sa mga acting bida, sa mga another characters, the motivations, the important here is they have a motivation na sila motivate para mas manice ang pag-film because na-enhance ang characters, na-motivate ang mga characters, they have a goal in that particular film. The basic themes, the topics, the subject matter, the social, cultural, psychological, professional, political, sexual, moral, and the values. So the setting, the geographical and historical. So the important is they have a setting so that you can para maka-film yun sila nice. So the iconography, the echoing, the narrative, characterization, the themes, and the setting. Kaninong pinagsama na ang lahat. A familiar stack of image or motifs, the connotation of which have become fixed, the primarily but not necessarily visual, including the decor, the costumes, and objects, certain typecase performers, some of whom may have become icons, familiar patterns of dialogue, characteristic music and sounds, and appropriate physical topography, and the filmic techniques. So, syempre, you cannot just like filming if you have no techniques. So, it has a stylistic or formal convention of the camera works. So, nasa cameraman na siya kung saan niya. But, sa director paano sa camera mano na siya unsa niya pag um, gamit ang camera, paggamit sa mga lighting and also sa editing, the sound recording, the use of the color, if it is ga ano ba siya ga what if ang scene is naa sa uh, at night, 'di ba? For example, ang scene is at night and then ang imuhang lightning is color sa lightning is na na full nimo og adlaw. So, dili na siya mag-contradict na siya kay because ang imuhang scene is night but ang imuhang light is for the morning. So dapat mag-same na sila og lightning para it will look nice and manindot yun ang kalabasan sa imuhang i-film. So and also the viewers para it will easily to identify ang scene pala dyan ay they are in the ocean, then it is night, naligo pa sila or nagpicnic ba sila sa night or nag-night swimming, just like para easily lang siya ma-identify, ma-interpret sa viewers. Viewers are often less conscious of such conventions than of those relating to content. Yes. So some film genres tend to be defined primarily by their subject matter. For example, the detective films, some by their setting, the western, and the other by the narrative form, example, the musical. So let's say to place in one of the traditional categories are mood and tone, which are key features of film noir. In addition, the textual features different genres in any medium also involve different purposes, pleasures, audiences, modes of involvement, styles of interpretation, and text reader relationship, an issue to which we will return shortly. So, the codes of realism. So, all representation are system of codes. Realism involves an instrumental view of the medium as a neutral means of representing reality. The signified is foregrounded at the expense of the signifier. Realist representation practices tend to mask the processes involved in producing text as if they were slices of life untouched by human hand. Ironically, the naturalness of realist text comes not from the reflection of reality but from their uses of codes which are derived from another text. The familiarity of popular semiotic practices renders their mediation visible. So the photography involves a new way of seeing which had been learned before it could become transparent. So in photography, dapat you know how to use before ka musabak sa particular nga scene. So what human beings see does not resemble a sequence of the rectangle frames, and camera work and editing convention are not direct replications of the way in which we see the everyday world. So, yes, 'di ba? Just like kung unsa what you can see in that particular codes or image in the photography, dumaan na niyan sa mga edit na siya mga edit for example, pwede gihapon nimo ma-edit ang isa ka tawo even though nga gipicture nimo siya nga nakamugot or he or she is not happy but you can use your editing techniques to para mo-smile siya even though na they are not happy. So, to get a clearer view, we can adjust the focus of our eye. So, to identify kung gi-edit ba jud na siya, di ba? It is the code of realism. To identify if that particular is edited or something na mayroon ng mga sagol-sagol ang images, you can view it clearly by adjusting or focusing. You can focus that image iklaro jud kay nimo mura kag detective Conan nga imuha jud na siyang i-identify or isa-isahon jud na nimo unsay nalahi kasi it will be obvious kung naa jud na siya malahi. Obvious gihapon na siya bisag ka na mga mag-edit-edit nga wala ka ng mga professional editors nandili nimo you cannot identify if it is a edit or not, but we can critique makuan na gihapon na nimo kay daghang kitang mga assumptions, di ba? And then gamiton ang pagka-simulation, ang mga interpretation, different kind of interpretation. But for making sense of when we look at the photograph, none of this help. We have to decode the ghost. Simulation argue that although exposure over time leads visual language to seem natural, we need to learn how to read even visual and audio-visual text. So as noted earlier, Peirce referred to the sign in an edited photographic media as being indexical as well as iconic. So meaning that the signifiers did not simply resemble their signified but were mechanical recording the reproduction of them within the limitation of the medium. John Berger also argued that photographs are automatic records of being seen and the photography has no language of its own. So most simulations emphasize that photography involves visual codes and that film and television involve both visual and oral codes. John Tagg argues that the camera is never neutral. So while some photographic and film codes are relatively arbitrary, many of the codes employed in realistic photographic image or films simulate many of the perceptual cues used in encountering the physical world. This is the key reason of their perceived realism. So the depiction of the reality even in the iconic signs involve the variable code which have to be learned yet which with experience come to be taken for granted as transparent and abused. Eco argues that it is misleading to regard such sign as less conventional than other kinds of signs. Even photography and film involve conventional codes. So, in the code of the realism, most of the discussion on formalism and realism tend toward the camera movement, the position, the framing, the lighting. But it's important to remember that other things can be formalist or realist as well. So, in the invisible editing, simulation often refers to reading film or television, a notion which may seem strange since the meaning of filming image appears not to need decoding at all. So consider the following sample offered by Ralph Rosenblum, a major professional film editor. In an initial shot, a man awakens suddenly in the middle of night, bolts up in the bed, stares ahead intensely, and twitches his nose. If we then cut to a room where two people are desperately fighting a bellowing blades, the viewers realize that though clairvoyance, a warning dream, or the smell of smoke, the man in bed has become aware of danger. Alternatively, if we cut from the first shot to a distraught wife defending her decision to commit her husband to a mental institution, they will understand that the man in bed is her husband and that the dramatic tension will surround the couple. So, if it's a Hitchcock movie, juxtaposition of the man and the wife will immediately raise questions in the viewer's minds about foul play on the part of the woman. This form of editing may alert us not only to a link between the two consecutive shots, but in some cases to a consecutive shot, but in some cases to a genre. If we cut to an image of clouds drifting before the full moon, we know that we can expect a Wolfman adventure. So such interpretations are not self-evident. They are a feature of a filmic editing code. So having internalized such codes at a very young age, we can cease to be conscious of their existence. So this cinematic editing code had become so familiar to us that we no longer consciously notice its convention until they are broken. Indeed, it seems so natural that some will feel that it closely reflects phenomenal reality and thus find it hard to accept it as a code at all. Do we not mentally cut from one image to another all of the time in everyday visual perception? This case seems strongest when all that is involved is a shift corresponding to a turn of our head or a refocusing on the eyes. But of course, many cuts would require us to change our viewing position. We need to remind ourselves that it's not only the visual image which is mediated, constructed, and codified in the various media in film, television, and radio. This also applies to sound, film, and television are not simply visual media but audio-visual media. Even where the mediated character of the visual is acknowledged, there are a tendency for sound to be regarded as largely unmediated. But codes are involved in the choice and positioning of the microphones, but the use of the particular equipment for recording, editing, and the production. So the use of the diegetic sound versus non-diegetic sound, direct versus post-synchronous recording, simultaneous sound, and so on. In the dominant Hollywood tradition, convention sound codes included the features such as the diegesis sound should be relevant to the story. So, the diegesis sound, so it is very important that the sound is relevant to the story. Kay kung dili jud ang sound relevant sa story, maot kayo siya paminawon og dili siya masakto unsaon natong code nga imuhang diegesis kay what example horror imuhang story and then imuhang sound is happy. So unsaon nimo pag-interpret nga horror then happy, dapat mapareha siya. Then hierarchy, dialogue should override background sound. Then seamlessness, no gaps or abstract changes in sound. Dapat wala siya kanang what is that kung imuhang sound is happy, don't ayaw siya i-trouble sa sadness nga sound. Kung happy lang siya, don't put a contradictory nga malagyan siya ng sadness. So the integration, no sound without images or vice versa. Readability, all sound should be identifiable. Motivation and usual sound should be what characters are supposed to be hearing. So, in the motivation, so, syempre, if your character is need to motivate, dapat ang music po nimo motivation, dili po na, kung imuhang character is sad, syempre, need siya og motivation, then imuhang sound is pang jolly. So, syempre, para siyang katatawanan lang kay where's the motivation in that sound, di ba? Mawala siya. So, next is the broadcast and the narrowcast code. So, some codes are more widespread and accessible than others. Those which are widely distributed and which are learned at an early age may seem natural rather than constructed. So, broadcast code are learned through experience. So, the narrow codes involve more deliberate learning. So the broadcast, 'di ba? Uh, sa broadcast mga these are the experience of us, then the narrowcast it is a learning deliberate more deliberate learning. So following the controversial sociolinguistic theory of Basil Bernstein was what Fesky refers to as broadcast code are described by some media theories as restricted codes, with flex narrowcast code being described as elaborated code. Restricted codes are described as structurally simpler and more repetitive, having what information theories call a high degree and redundancy. In contrast, literary writing, in particular poetry, has a minimum of redundancy. The distinction between restricted and the elaborated codes serve as the stress and difference between an elite and the majority. Feast suggests that the narrowcast code have the potential to be more subtitle broadcast code can lead to click. Terry Eagleton argued that literary texts are code productive and code transgressive rather than merely code confirming, insofar as such positions suggest that broadcast codes restrict expressive possibilities. This argument has affinities with Formianism. The dangers of elitism inherent in such stances make it particularly important that the evidence is closely examined in the context of the particular code under study. So, the different shape of the broadcast and the narrowcast codes. In broadcasting, the intended audience of the message is broad, and the message aims at appealing to the masses. On the other hand, with the narrowcast, the intended audience with the message is narrow and the message is targeted to appeal to the interests and preferences of the specific groups. So the lastly is the interaction of the textual codes. So any text uses not one code but many. Theories vary in their classification, but such code in his books S and Z, Roland Barthes itemized 5 codes employed in literal text: the hermeneutic or the narrative turning points, the proiretic, the basic narrative actions, the cultural, the prior social knowledge, the semic, the medium-related codes, and the symbolic or the themes. So the same signifier may play its part in several different codes. The meaning of literary text may thus be underdetermined by several codes. Just as sign need to be analyzed in the relation to other signs, so codes need to be analyzed in relation to the other codes. So the codification, the synchronic perspective of the historian semioticist tends to give the impression that codes are static, but codes have origin and they do evolve. And studying the evolution in legitimate semiotic endeavor. So codes are dynamic systems which change over time and are thus historically as well as the socio-culturally situated. Codification is a process whereby conventions are established. For instance, the myths notes how in Hollywood cinema the white hat become codified and the signifier of a good cowboy. Eventually, this convention become overused and was abandoned. In historical perspective, many of the codes of the new medium evolved from those of relative existing media. For instance, many televisual techniques owe their origins to their use in film and photography. In historical perspective, many of the codes of a new medium evolves from those of related existing media. For instance, many televisual techniques owe their origin on their use in film and photography. New conventions are also developed to match the technical potential of the medium and the uses to which it put. So some codes are unique to or at least characteristic of specific medium or to closely related media. Others are shared by several media and some are drawn from cultural practices which are not tied to a medium. So codes cannot account for everything in human culture and communication. Social behavior and textual practices cannot simply be reduced to the operation of the semiotic codes. So codes cannot account for everything in human culture and communication. So social behavior and textual practices cannot simply be reduced to the operation of the semiotic codes. They are not autonomous determinants of the human action. Historical changes in social and textual pattern attest to the importance of human agency and textual transgression. However, recognizing the limitation of the concept of codes does not mean that it has no in seeking to identify patterns in textual and social practices, or even that codes never appears to exhibit some degree of relative autonomy, nor, as we will see in the next chapter, that endorsement of the concept necessarily required meaning to be related purely to codes, even in structuralist models of human communication. So that's all. Thank you, everyone. If you have a question, then you can also comment down. Thank you.